favor. He's given you that favor. So when you have, arguably, when you have Billy bringing her all of these Lady Anne roses, he's bringing her God's grace, right? He's bringing her that. Aunt Elle is pretty upset about it. And then she gets a switch, or a tree limb, not a limb, but a kind of a branchlet, a switch from the peach tree, and she's going to go and she's going to hit him with this. The peach tree, the symbolism on peach tree. This one's really good because I think it matches up perfectly. The peach tree is the sacred tree of immortality, youth, prevention of the aging process. So if you have Aunt Elle who's going to go over there and hit him with this peach tree switch, that means that she's trying to stop him from growing up. She's trying to stop him from maturing to the point where he will leave his mother behind and find his way to a young woman, right? Which might be kind of that threshold and that point of no return. Like I said, there'll be other things that come with this yearning for Miss Bobbitt. There'll be other things that we could say are rites of passage or marks of passage for Billy Bob. And we'll see what some of those are in a little bit. She hits him with it. It's pretty much inferred that she hits him with it, but he doesn't say he's sorry and he doesn't cry. Maybe that too is a mark of some kind of maturity in him, a kind of progression or transition from boyhood to a young manhood. No more need to say I'm sorry. No more need for tears here, right? He runs and climbs up a pecan tree, and he says he's never going to come down. If you look up pecan tree, what we find for pecan tree is money and employment. Now this seems to kind of match up, because where does she find him? He's at a car garage, and he's studying somebody putting together a motor. Essentially there is some employment, or there's an occupation there. The way I kind of look at all of this is, the first step is being attracted to a woman and having that overcome you, right? And then the next step is a young man, a kid who's becoming a kind of, going from boyhood to kind of an adolescence or into a young adulthood. The next step after that is, now I got to get a job. I got to get something that's going to kind of prove that I am a man and bring me into the adult world here. This is the first kind of reference to money and employment. Later on, this is just going to be validated later, because what does Miss Bobbitt make Preacher Star and Billy Bob do? Work for her, right? And sell magazines and make money and kind of have a business entrepreneurship going. So again, it's a mark of adulthood, right? And the pecan tree represents money and employment. All right. So what is clear is that Aunt Elle wants to maintain control of him and keep him from Miss Bobbitt. The question is that even possible at this point? All right, let's talk about the boys. What they do to get her attention. It says here they wrestled, and this is just the boys in general who are trying to get the attention of Miss Bobbitt. They wrestled, they played Tarzan, and they did full-hearted bicycle tricks. It was a sorry business. These seem like failed attempts, failed kind of, let's say, crude tactics, crude boyhood tactics to try to get a girl's attention. And they don't work on somebody as mature and sophisticated and cosmopolitan as Miss Bobbitt. They wrestled, right? It's kind of a very easy sign of aggression. Look, I can tackle this kid and I can hold him down, right? Yay for me! Aren't you finding this impressive? Miss Bobbitt says no. They played Tarzan. And that's almost like a primitive sense of like masculinity that just doesn't have an effect either, right? And bicycle tricks as well, right? It's kind of the same thing. None of this works. In paragraph, couple sentences later, even Cora McCall, Mary Murphy Jones, Janice Ackerman, even they're trying to get a look from Miss Bobbitt, as to say they're trying to be validated. They're trying to have their kind of presence or character or being validated by just a glance from Miss Bobbitt. So we can see that the effect that she's having on this town is very profound, as they need to be seen by her. Okay, moving on to the next page is where it seems to reach a culminating peak. It's the paragraph that begins with, then one day the boys were being crazier than usual. So if you thought they were acting strange, you haven't seen nothing yet. I'll just read this. Billy Bob was sagging around in his daddy's World War khakis. I think it is the pinnacle of masculinity, which is war, right? And a man's participation in war, bravery, courage, grit, right? All of these things we can associate with men and war. Even nowadays, you have a contingency of men in the military saying, no, women can't do this. That's only what men can do, right? So we're still seeing these attitudes. And Billy Bob is essentially getting in touch or exemplifying these attitudes. Preacher Star is even more awkward and insane. He says, and it says, and Preacher, stripped to the waist, had a naked woman drawn on his chest with one of Aunt Elle's old lipsticks. The kind of desperation that we see with these boys and what they're doing because of the influence of Miss Bobbitt, that they think this is, I guess there's a couple ways of looking at this. They think this is going to impress her, or at the same time, because they have this kind of older, this young girl who passes herself off as somebody very kind of mature and elegant, it's causing them to kind of lose control of themselves, and they don't know what they need to express in order to get her attention here. But it is very strange. Now, in this paragraph, they give a young black girl, let's see here, Rosalba Cat, a very hard time. This is where it becomes quite difficult. I'm not sure exactly what to make of Rosalba Cat. Just to give some symbolism, Rosalba is just another name for rose, so we're talking about white rose. And usually when you talk about white rose, I guess you're talking about a kind of a purity and an innocence. She is carrying blackberries, and the Christian symbolism of blackberries is spiritual neglect or ignorance. But again, I'm not sure if all of this kind of matches up. Now, we can be clear on the plot. What does happen? What does happen is Billy Bob and Preacher Star, it sounds like they stop her in the middle of the road, middle of the street, and they say, you gotta pay a tariff here. And she goes, I don't deal with tariffs. What are you talking about? I don't deal with tariffs. And then it sounds like they try to like sexually exploit her. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course. But they say here, a party in the barn, said Preacher between clenched teeth, mighty nice party in the barn. And she, with a sulky shrug, said, she intended studying no barn parties. So it sounds like they were like, yeah, you got to go in the barn with us. Which again, I'm not too sure what to make of that. What does happen, though, we can be very clear. Miss Bobbitt comes and essentially stands up for her, protects her, and essentially takes her under her wing. And from that moment on, they are seen as inseparable. They are kind of best friends, and they refer to themselves as sister. I don't know if there's a religious kind of connotation as far as like nuns go, right? Sister this, sister that, or if it's really just a friendship thing. Not too sure. This is where I think, we talked earlier, does that dichotomy of good and evil really work for us in this text? And this is where it starts to become a little hazy for me, because I'm not sure what Capote's approach to African American kind of politics is in his writing. Again, I read the entire book a long time ago. I thoroughly enjoyed it, loved his style, but I've never really analyzed it on this particular level. So I don't know what his feelings are toward African American issues, racial issues, issues of equality and equity. I'm not too sure. In fact, that would probably take some research. But what I can see here is Miss Bobbitt is such a strong, independent figure and has such an effect on this town. Whatever she does, people acknowledge it, and they say, okay, that's the way that it is. That when she starts to link up with Rosalba Cat, this young black girl, they question it first. Even Mrs. Sawyer is like, why I gotta have this black person? She uses the N-word. I don't use the N-word. But it's there. We see that it's being used. We have the context. But even Mrs. Sawyer is like, I don't want this black girl on my porch all the time, right? That's not cool. But the town has this way of accepting the decisions of Miss Bobbitt. And from a reader standpoint, if she's linked up with this black girl and they're hanging out, right, and they chase the dogs around town, they liken the dogs to devils, I think, at some point. If Miss Bobbitt has taken it upon herself to link up with Rosalba here, and the town has acknowledged that and said, yes, that's okay, right? We accept this, then Miss Bobbitt comes across as a virtuous character for me, at least in this moment, right? But I don't know if that holds up with some of the other things that we see later on. It's kind of like teeter-totters and goes back and forth. Okay, Mr. Henderson, somebody who lives in the house with them. Henderson translates as rich ruler of the home. So he's got this kind of authority as far as the symbolism of his name. And what do they do to this guy? Well, he's a tyrant, it seems. He kind of gets angry at them for stealing his toilet paper. I'm not sure if there's symbolism needed there, but that's what he gets angry about. And eventually basically, I don't know if he's drunk or not, but he comes out and he's just a hot mess. It says right here, when the two girls were sitting under a tree in the yard, Mr. Henderson, sporting nothing more than a nightshirt, stamped out after them. "Steal all my toilet paper, will ya?" he hollered. "I'll show you midgets." And it's Billy Bob, so they kind of come and help out here. Billy Bob and Preacher catch Mr. Henderson, tie him up. However, it's Miss Bobbitt who ties him in such a way as to make him, essentially to render him completely harmless and ineffective. So yes, it's Preacher Starch, these two young men who come in and tie him up in the first place, but I'll just read this. Miss Bobbitt, who had behaved with admirable calm, told the men they did not know how to tie a proper knot, and undertook it to do so herself. She did such a good job that all the circulation stopped in Mr. Henderson's hands and feet, and it was a month before he could walk again. So I think if you talk about Henderson's symbolic meaning, rich ruler of the home, especially as a man, especially as this kind of kooky man who seems to be, just old and outdated. It takes a strong woman to take this old traditional strong man and put him in his place once and for all, and to even do it better than these other young men can do. So again, for me, at least as a reader, this comes across as a virtuous characteristic, but that's just my opinion. All right. Here's the big pages. This is probably some of the most important stuff in the entire short story. And again, very kind of coincidentally, right after that incident with Mr. Henderson, where there's a real clear expression of kind of woman's, superiority and kind of strength over this old man, then we get this talk of the devil and God. And this is when Miss Bobbitt, on a Sunday when everyone else is at church, kind of creates her own kind of religious environment and comes to the home of Billy Bob and Aunt Elle. They're at church, but it seems like Mr. C, our narrator, is home, and they have a conversation. And again, Mr. C, it just shouts out to me Capote, right? He's kind of putting himself in this text. Again, I could be wrong. These are all just things I have in mind. I'll read this. This is in the paragraph. It was shortly afterwards that Miss Bobbitt paid us a call. Feel free to cue up. Here she says, "I don't want you to think I'm a heathen. heathen being as kind of something sinister and filled with vice and sin of the devil, right? I don't want you to think I'm a heathen, Mr. C. I've had enough experience to know that there is a God and that there is a devil. But the way to tame the devil is not to go down there to church and listen to what a sinful, mean fool he is. When I talk about the words, when I hear the words tame and mean fool, I think of Mr. Henderson. That's what it makes me think of. Definitely a fool. And was he tamed? Absolutely. Tied up, restricted, and tamed, right? So I go right back to that. Plus, it just happened, right? So as far as what the author is trying to kind of put together here, it's right there. It's very proximal. No, love the devil like you love Jesus, because he is a powerful man and will do you a good turn if he knows you trust him. He has frequently done me good turns, like at dancing school in Memphis. I always called in the devil to help me get the biggest part in our annual show. That is common sense, you see. I knew Jesus wouldn't have any truck with dancing. So what she's saying here is, she has respect for the devil because he can grant you things that Christ just doesn't care about, like dancing, right? And stuff that we could refer to as Hellenistic culture as opposed to Hebraistic. So that's why you have respect for the devil. He can help you with these things. Moving on. Now, as a matter of fact, I have called the devil just recently. He is the only one who can help me get out of this town. There's another reason she wants the devil, to help her get out of this town. Not that I live here, not exactly. I think always about somewhere else where everything is dancing, like people dancing in the streets, and everything is pretty, like children on their birthdays. And hence you get the title. So if you put this all together, Miss Bobbitt longs to escape and feels that the devil, or having a certain respect for the devil, is the only thing that can help her escape. Until then, as she's stuck in this town where she doesn't really want to be, it's the next best thing for her, as she'll say later. Until then, she lives elsewhere in a world of pretty, like children on their birthdays. So this kind of endless world of pretty is just like children on their birthdays. Now, this was a question that you dealt with in your discussion questions, which is, what does it mean? I'll just read the question. Aside from a party and presents, those are always nice, what are the deeper implications of a child on their birthday, especially as likened to this idea of being pretty? Well, it's obviously a kind of, you're getting older, which means there should be some form of maturity there, right? And maybe there is a very profound transition that's taking place there. It's a rite of passage. But at the same time, everything is pretty, right? Like children on their birthdays. And that's what she's longing for, to live in a place where that is kind of what happens in perpetuity. That's always taking place. All right. This leads her to say, I want Preacher Star and Billy Bob to start selling magazines for me. And the magazine she mentions here is Reader's Digest, Popular Mechanics, Dime Detective, and Child's Life. And all of these have, pretty interesting implications or connections to other things that take place. For instance, Dime Detective. Okay, now we're talking about the Sherlock Holmes that is referenced later on in a few pages. Reader's Digest. That's interesting because we're talking about a cosmopolitan kind of culture finding its way into this small southern society. So it's all about disrupting what's taking place in this society. Even Popular Mechanics, we had the mechanics from earlier when he was looking at the cars there. And this also represents a entrepreneurship and getting a job and kind of growing up in that respect too. Children on their birthdays, right? Again, what are the implications of a birthday aside from just a party and presents? Hopefully we came up with just at least a few ideas. All right, so now they get into this whole kind of employment triangle. Billy Bob, Preacher Star, and Miss Bobbitt. Miss Bobbitt, of course, is like the boss. And they start to get a little jealous of each other. Preacher Job says Billy Bob is stealing, funds and stuff like that. And that kind of basically gets in the way of their relationship. All right, I will skip well ahead here. There's a fight between the two boys, and it kind of serves as a break between their relationship, and it leads to a lot of stress and a lot of, I guess we could say, heartache, anguish, mental anguish for these boys. This is important. It's the paragraph that begins with, "Preacher spit on the ground and swaggered over to Billy Bob." I'll let you cue that up, and I'll start reading. "Come on," he said, just as though nothing had happened. "She's a hard one, she is. She don't want nothing but to make trouble between two good friends." For a moment, it looked as if Billy Bob was going to join him in a peaceful togetherness. But suddenly, coming to his senses, he drew back and made a gesture. The boys regarded each other for a full minute, all the closeness between them turning an ugly color. You can't hate so much unless you love too. And Preacher's face showed all of this. So Preacher Star is definitely understanding of that message. And I'll repeat it. You can't hate so much unless you love too. And I think the most accurate way of understanding that is because he starts to have this real love and adoration for Miss Bobbitt and perhaps what she represents, right? Not just a girl, but a mature, sophisticated, cosmopolitan girl who is kind of unique in her own way. Because he's starting to have love for her, it's now causing him to have hate for what was once previously a good friend of his, Billy Bob. So once that love starts to kind of rise up for somebody, the hate, especially if it's somebody who's contending for that love can start to also build up as well. There might be other ways of looking at it, but that's just one way of understanding that statement. All right. Now, this is interesting. Moving on with that paragraph, I'll just finish it off. But there was nothing for him to do except go away. "Oh, yes, Preacher, you looked so lost that day that for the first time I really liked you." This is the narrator. This is very, let's say, unusual for the narrator to kind of make these kinds of statements and use the personal pronoun I. It doesn't happen often. And he says, "Oh, yes, Preacher, you looked so lost that day that for the first time I really liked you. So skinny and mean and lost going down the road all by yourself." He is skinny here. Billy Bob was skinny, described as skinny early in the text. Who's the only fat character that we have? And again, sometimes I don't know exactly what to make of it. I can just point it out. I can point out the contrast. I can point out what's happening here, right? Who's the only character that's really described as obese? Time and time again. Well, there's actually two, but one who really stands out is Rosalba Cat. She's constantly referred to as fat and blubbering and big, right? So we have a contrast here to Preacher, who here is skinny and mean and lost going down the road all by yourself. I guess this is interesting because it's a revelation for the narrator that Preacher Star is vulnerable, right? That because he's been a part of this kind of love syndicate, this love triangle, and he's been rejected and neglected, and it's also led to the kind of diffusion of a relationship he's had with Billy Bob, that he's now lost and feeling this kind of pain, I guess we could say. And this is what makes him likable for the narrator, which is to say that up to this point, Preacher Star was never a likable character for the narrator. Okay? All right. Next paragraph that follows, I'll just say it. It sounds like Preacher Star, in an interesting way, basically cuts off the relationship. He sends him a Sherlock Holmes book, and then he scribbles in one of the pages, "Friends like ivy on the wall must fall." Just a moment later, you do get the word Jesus. Again, it says Jesus, what a dope he is. Now again, you could see that as just kind of common tongue, common vernacular, colloquial use of Jesus. Oh, Jesus, what a bad day, right? However, I think because of the religious stuff that's taking place throughout this text, we need to look at that a little bit different. It might be a direct reference to Christ and the ideologies of Christ, and not sure exactly how we kind of apply it, but that's probably what's happening there, right? one more thing to say about Preacher Star and what the narrator, why the narrator likes him at this point. It may be because this vessel of anger and aggression, which is Preacher Star, is now lost on account of the simplicity and complexity of love. The narrator now finally likes him, right? He's been humanized in that way. Okay. In the paragraph that begins with, but most of the time he was happy because Miss Bobbitt was there. It's a long paragraph, but about halfway through you got this guy in the newspaper who wrote a piece, Horace Deasley, and he writes a piece called A Tragic Situation, and this is when they refused to go to school. And that was one of the questions that you dealt with. Miss Bobbitt says, why do we have to go to school? We don't need to go to school, right? We will be better off not going to public school or any school. And she says it for herself. She says it for Sister Rosalba. Nobody cared because Rosalba was a black girl, so nobody cared anyways. Welcome to Southern society, right? And at least this Southern society. And also Billy Bob, right? Billy Bob doesn't need to go to school either. The idea is that Billy Bob is kind of working on this magazine enterprise, and that's good enough, right? That's all he needs to focus on. So you have some people who kind of get outraged by this, and they write this guy Horace Deasley. Horace translates as timekeeper, which is interesting, right? If you're thinking about like the passing of time and ideas that are fit for a particular time period. He writes a piece called A Tragic Situation, and they're pretty harsh. They say, how could a small girl defy the Constitution of the United States? So again, kind of looking at her as a woman, as a girl, and saying, how dare she try to disrupt what's happening here? And then they even say like she should be kind of whipped and beat. So I'm not going to do much analysis here, but it's a very harsh kind of opinion coming from the men of this town toward this young girl, right? Is she really deserving of that? But it's amazing. It's almost surreal that a young girl could have this kind of impact on a town, especially a town of men, right? It's quite fascinating. It almost seems like surreal in some ways. All right, now we got Manny Fox. Manny Fox comes and he basically kind of takes advantage of people, the boys and the girls. And it's important to note that it is Miss Bobbitt who falls for the con the hardest. Where the idea is, I can get you into Hollywood pictures, I can make you famous. For the young men, he's like, I can put you on, sailing vessels, and you're going to have this adventure, and I'll take you away from the small town, stagnated life, and everybody falls for it. And again, I think it's kind of here at this point you see the real theme of rural versus cosmopolitan culture, right? That rural is boring and kind of kept and restrained, and cosmopolitan is adventure and possibility and potential. And everybody in this town, especially now that Manny Fox has arrived, wants a piece of that action, right? They want to be kind of swept away from a culture and experience that is far different from what they're used to in this town. And it all culminates in what seems to be like a talent show. And a grand prize is that Manny Fox promises that he will put them in the pictures, right? He'll put them all in the pictures. So what ends up happening in this talent show? Well, there's some acts here which are kind of quite hilarious. One that sometimes I just put LOL as an annotation, right? Because the one that really I think is hilarious is, it says, including Eustacia Bernstein, who imitated movie stars so that they all sounded like Eustacia. I mean, that's just hilarious, right? They all just sound like her, and that's her big act. But the one that really sticks out here is obviously when Miss Bobbitt gets up there almost like an adult, quite lewd. We go back to that Hellenistic culture, which is kind of a celebration of the body. Obviously, when you think about like pornography, that's incredibly Hellenistic, right? And you have a lot of kind of Orthodox religions which speak negatively against pornography. And the only reason I mention pornography is for the time period she shows her underwear. She shows her lace blue underwear, and she's such a young girl that it's quite awkward, right? It's almost shocking. But that's what she does. And it even says here, and this is the paragraph that begins with, it's a long paragraph. It starts with, but the night of the show, exclamation point. Within this paragraph, far into it, it says, you got Preacher Star, which maybe is your best example of Hebraistic kind of culture, right? I would imagine he's a good example of Hebraistic culture in this piece. He's booing every act that comes out here, right? Just booing everybody. And the only person, however, he ever applauded was Miss Bobbit. But there's something about Miss Bobbit. And he says, no doubt, the narration says, no doubt the devil was on her side, but she deserved it. And you get some other devilish characteristics here. She's hissing at Miss Adeline to go faster and faster, who's playing the piano. And then it says right here, if you don't like my peaches, this is what she's singing. If you don't like my peaches, stay away from my can. Aho, aho. Aunt Elle gasped. She gasped again when Miss Bobbit, with a bump, upended her skirt to display blue lace underwear. And this is kind of the big shocker. But believe it or not, this is what wins her the show. Then, she does a little bit more than that. Moving on, a couple lines down, Miss Adeline commenced an ominous thundering in the darker keys, at which point Sister Rosalba, carrying a lighted Roman candle, rushed on stage and handed it to Miss Bobbit, who was in the midst of a full split. It's a Roman candle, kind of taking us, I would imagine, back to Hellenistic culture, because it's what's kind of being presented to us. And just as she did, the Roman candle burst into fiery balls of red, white, and blue. Hellenistic culture, it seems like, is being combined with a certain kind of patriotism there, as we have the colors of the red, the white, and the blue. She wins the competition. But of course, we know that nothing comes of it. Manny does not follow through with the promise of kind of, trying to make her a film star. None of that stuff happens. Okay. Once she finds out that she's duped and she's taken on the con, Manny Fox does not follow through with the award for that competition. Then she starts a group called the Manny Fox Hangman's Club, and this is where, again, it kind of fluctuates, and I'm very confused on how to think of Miss Bobbit. At this point, she kind of brings the town together and kind of works to get back the money that all of these young men have lost. And that seems like a pretty redeemable quality. But just about a page later, then she says, after they've gotten that money back, she says, okay, now why don't you give it to me and fund my Hollywood career? And if you do, I will give you 10% of my earnings. And they do, right? And I think that's what kind of sets her up for leaving this town. She gets people to basically fund her, I think it's her trip to Hollywood, so that she can try to become a famous star, Hollywood star. Remember preacher star? Now we have Hollywood star, right? They seem to be at odds with one another. So I don't know what to make of her. On one hand, she helps people get their money back. That seems like a pretty virtuous thing to do. And then just a page later, she's like, give me that money and I'm going to go be a star. Maybe that's virtuous too. Again, I have a hard time with some of the analysis on the story. That brings us to this wonderful end. And I say that kind of with some humor, I guess. It's quite tragic, really. But the weird thing that happens here is you have the reunification, the reuniting of Preacher Star and Billy Bob, as Billy Bob is picking some more Lady Anns, right, which is essentially to be in God's favor, Anne represents to be in God's favor. She's even said to be, it looks as though Miss Bobbit is going to a communion. Again, more religious allusions. And communion is when you're going for a big rite of passage within a religious context, right? Some of you may have had a communion. And she's dressed like she's about to do this. She's wearing white, purity, innocence, right? She's kind of there. Now, this is not to say that maybe she hasn't had that before, but in this moment, that's the way she's dressed. And it's like she's going to a communion. And you have Billy Bob picking these Lady Anns, and he's going to bring her a bouquet. And then all of a sudden, Preacher Star shows up. And they haven't hung out or been friends in quite some time. And I'll just read this. For hours, Preacher Star had been hanging around town at the corner, sometimes standing at the curb tossing a coin, and sometimes hiding behind a tree, as if he didn't want anyone to see him. It made everybody nervous. About 20 minutes before bus time, he sauntered up and leaned against our gate. Billy Bob was still in the garden picking roses. By now, he had enough for a bonfire. Now, that's weird. That's weird because you're picking these roses, so why would the narrator say almost enough for a bonfire? That makes me think of the burning of witches, right? And that takes us back to that